Hello, I'm Juan Cole. I teach modern Middle Eastern and South Asian history at the University of Michigan. Last week, I asked you to send in your questions about the significance of 9/11 and its aftermath. And this week, I'll try my best to answer the questions you did send in.
Several people, including John Thorpe, Alicia Height, and Kevin Essington, have asked what America's presence in Iraq and Afghanistan will look like in the near future.
With regard to Iraq, the Status of Forces Agreement that was negotiated between the Bush administration and the Iraqi parliament in late 2008 specifies that all U.S. troops should be out of Iraq by the end of 2011. Recently, it's been announced that President Obama will try to negotiate a provision whereby about 2,000 or 3,000 U.S. troops might remain after that date. However, at one point the U.S. had 150,000 troops in Iraq. More recently, it's been about 47,000 in the first half of 2011. But the likelihood is that by the end of the year, virtually all U.S. troops will be out of that country. Of course, it will still have a very large embassy. There will be guards at that embassy. There will be private security contractors, some call them mercenaries, on the ground from the American side. So it won't be a complete disengagement probably, but with regard to having a big troop force in the country, that looks like it's going to soon be over with. With regard to Afghanistan, the situation is much more complex. But there's a general agreement that by 2014, the big NATO forces and the U.S. forces will gradually have been drawn out. I think France and Britain have announced they're leaving by that date. Canada is already out. The Netherlands is out. And on the other hand, in Afghanistan, it has been announced that by President Hamid Karzai that he would make a provision for U.S. troops to remain in the country at some force level through the early 2020s.
Hannah and Richard want to know what the world would look like if 9/11 never happened. And they also want to know what the world would look like if America had not retaliated by going to war with Iraq and Afghanistan.
Had 9/11 never happened, it seems to me that the American public would never have agreed to permit the U.S. government to conduct another land war in Asia. So there would have been no Iraq war. And of course, there would have been no U.S. war in Afghanistan either. So the world would have been very different in that regard. Even after 9/11 did occur, the Bush administration did have choices as to how to respond. The initial response in Afghanistan was to overthrow the Taliban, to destroy the training camps of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and I think those were wise decisions. But then beyond that, the Pentagon decided to try to keep large numbers of U.S. troops on the ground in Afghanistan, and then to bring in NATO troops so that you had a fairly large foreign occupation of the country, which Afghans never in history have put up with. So it was predictable that the whole thing would go bad if you pursued that policy. There was no reason for the Bush administration to invade Iraq. It was not connected to 9/11. It was a diversion from the task of finding bin Laden and destroying al-Qaeda. And indeed, you see that when the focus was taken off Iraq by the Obama administration, they could actually succeed in tracking down bin Laden and making very serious inroads against al-Qaeda.
Beth Zurich asked, are you ready to say Bush and Cheney were right or wrong about their idea of planting seeds of democracy just because some citizens in the region are rebelling against their governments again?
Well, the Arab Spring protests of 2011 really are completely disconnected to anything that Bush or Cheney did. In fact, if you follow the tweets from Tahrir Square, downtown Cairo, or from Tunisia, people never said, "Oh, goody, let's try to be like the Iraq that the Americans created." And in fact, the only time Iraq is ever mentioned in those tweets is as a negative example. Oh, let's be careful not to do that. That's what they did in Iraq. So no, I think that it is wrong-headed to imagine that the kind of steps that the Bush and Cheney took in Iraq were in any way emulated, or that people wanted to emulate them in the region.
Debbie asks, why has U.S. foreign policy been so narrow-minded in scope when dealing with terrorism as a whole entity? And she also wants to know, why do policymakers refuse to look at the historical account of these countries before sending our troops in harm's way?
You know, policymakers are not historians. They are presented with particular problems or issues on a day-to-day basis, and they really have no time to do research or to take a long view. And people have complained to me who have served on the National Security Council that while you're there, you're running pillar to post, and you're basically using up whatever capital stock of knowledge you have built up during your career, because you have no opportunity to gain more while you're there. So I think it's just the character of policy making under pressure that it's going to inevitably be somewhat ahistorical and narrow. And that's why it's important for the U.S. public to elect leaders who come to the position with wide knowledge and experience. Often we hear from our politicians that, well, I don't know a lot about a lot of subjects, but I know how to choose good advisors and so forth. If you don't know about the subject, you won't be able to identify who the good advisor on it is. So it's important to put people in office who have that historical and geostrategic understanding, and it's very clear from listening to their speeches whether they have it or not. And it's been dismaying to me that people who poll well in American politics are often people who clearly do not have an understanding of how the world works or the specifics of international affairs. And since the president really presides over that sphere of politics, I really blame this gap on the American public being too trusting of claims of politicians that, well, they'll find a way to handle their ignorance. Much better to elect informed people to begin with.
Kevin Bunkley wants to know, has Obama succeeded in moving away from the freedom agenda? And he also wants to ask, assuming the drawdowns of Iraq and Afghanistan happen on schedule, what does the goal become, even though al-Qaeda is still around?
Well, it turns out that al-Qaeda was always overestimated as a force. It's a small terrorist organization. You know, sometimes it said, well, it had cells in 60 countries. Yeah, but you know, it was like 4 guys in each country. Except in Afghanistan and Pakistan, perhaps Yemen, it's a small organization. Even in Yemen, it's estimated there are 300 guys. In Afghanistan, less than 100. So for the United States to build al-Qaeda up as, you know, a major foreign policy challenge, something that has to be taken on with an $800 billion Pentagon budget, was always wrong-headed. I don't entirely agree that al-Qaeda is necessarily, you know, continuing as a big factor in world affairs. I think its command and control has been degraded. Its ability to carry out operations is much reduced. You know, with terrorism, you never can tell. A little bit of C4 explosives go a long way, and they could get lucky and have another strike. But as an organization, I think it's seen already its best days. With regard to the freedom agenda, I perceive the Obama administration to be more or less realist in its emphases. It's not looking for adventures. It's not looking for projects in the Middle East. It's trying to manage the region so as to preserve U.S. interests. I think it's ironic that the Bush administration went into a Middle East that was full of long-lived dictatorships and tried to shake it up. The Obama administration came with the opposite agenda of just trying to manage the region as it was and to pull back from that kind of muscular Wilsonianism. And yet the Obama administration was presented with a series of popular uprisings in the region that turned things upside down and presented severe challenges for U.S. foreign policy. So Obama now has to decide, you know, how far do you go in intervening in Syria? And I think his instinct is, well, financial sanctions, yes, but nothing really much more than that. And so it's a very different kind of approach than we saw in the Bush administration. Well, those were great informed questions. Thank you so much for them, and look out for the next topic at Ask M.